All right, hi everybody. It's 6:30 right now. We're gonna wait just a couple more minutes to get started as people kind of filter in. We still got people joining right now, so we're gonna get going any second now. Hi, Debbie.
Hello, Eric.
We're about ready to get this party started in just a moment here. Numbers still going up, people joining.
Can you hear me, Eric?
I can, Debbie.
Okay, just wanted to test.
I can see you too.
Yeah, so I'll put in a plug that in April, I'm doing a bird watching 101 class via Zoom. So this is my test tonight to make sure it all works. So anybody on here tonight's welcome to join that in April too on, what is it? April 15th, Kaskaskia Valley Audubon.
Awesome. Okay. I think we've given people enough time. So let's get this party started. Welcome everybody. My name is Eric Wright. Tonight we're doing part one of our native plant landscaping series, and we're going to talk about why we should have native plants in our yards. To start things off though, we're going to do kind of the Zoom version of everyone stand up and introduce yourself. And we're just going to do a little poll. If you guys could click the answers on the poll, and we can kind of share kind of where everybody's coming from and get a good idea for who's in this room right now. Emily, do you want to launch that poll now?
Everyone should be seeing the poll now.
Okay. We got votes coming in. Cool.
For some reason, I have no.
All right, we got 40 of 44 votes in here. So I just asked everybody, have you been to the Nature Institute before? Looks like 20% of you are lucky enough to have visited us. The other 80% we're still waiting to see you, but come see us anytime. Do you currently have native plants in your yard is our second question. It looks like three quarters of the people already have native plants. So that's a good start. I mean, to be expected to when you're doing a native plant webinar to have the native plant people in your webinar, of course. Have you been to TNI's native plant sale in the past? Looks like 7 people have been there. A lot more people could make a trip this year. And then we also asked, how did you find out about this webinar? And looks like a majority of people saw it through Facebook, but some people actually visit our website or they heard about it from a friend. Cool. Now we can get into the meat of the presentation. Oops. Emily, are you letting everybody in? Yep. Okay. All right. So let's start off with some brief introductions. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are the Nature Institute. We are a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to foster environmental awareness through education, preservation, and restoration. Just a couple of our organizational highlights. Our education programs are huge. In a typical year, we're hosting all kinds of field trips for school-age children. That's every spring and every fall. We do all kinds of cool special programming, both for adults and children alike. We also, during the summer, do our Discovery Day Camp, and those are week-long sessions where kids can come play outside with us and learn a little bit about nature while they're doing that. We are a 450-acre nature preserve, and in that nature preserve, we have over 8 miles of hiking trails. We're open to the public from April 1st through December, and you can come out and hike pretty much from dawn till dusk. Wait, yeah, I said that right. And another cool thing about us is we are a registered Illinois nature preserve. So that means our property is protected in perpetuity. So if we end up having to sell the property, something goes bad, the next owner can't develop this property. So it's going to remain a wild place for future generations to enjoy. So kind of behind the scenes tonight, my name's Eric, and I'm gonna give you your primary presenter. You're gonna hear my voice a lot, but Emily is kind of administering the webinar. If I screw something up, she's gonna help me fix it. And then I also have Debbie Newman with us from the Department of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And she's going to kind of be monitoring the chat. If there's any questions that come up, I'm not going to stop to answer them necessarily, but Debbie's going to be in that chat and she's going to be able to kind of give you a quick answer if you need it along the way. So as I mentioned, this is part 1 of our native plant landscaping series. And this is a 4-part series that we kind of built to kind of be a preface for our wildflower market coming up on May 8th. And this first webinar, we're going to talk about why we want the native plants in our landscaping. The second one, which is on April 1st, we're going to start talking about how to design your very own native plant project. And then the third one, we're probably going to do a little more design in the third one, but then we're also going to talk about installing your native plants and then also how to kind of maintain them over time. And then lastly, we're going to finish with a kind of like a virtual field trip of our greenhouse, because we do grow native plants here in a small greenhouse on our properties. And we kind of want to show how we do things, and maybe you might have some tips for us, or maybe you'll learn a thing or two from us too. I want to take a second to recognize our sponsors. We are a not-for-profit organization, so we're always trying new ways to gather money. There we go. So right now we have 3 sponsors for our greenhouse and all the greenhouse related events. Terry and Nancy Dueling, they're our neighbors, they're a great family, they do all kinds of great things for the community, and they've helped us out with some funding. We also have Mississippi Mud Pottery. They have all kinds of handcrafted stoneware that they make. It's a really neat place just to go visit and see what they have. They also do like cuts and pieces. It's pretty awesome. And then we have Juniper Environmental, which is a woman-owned business here in Alton. And they do all kinds of like environmental consulting project stuff. So like if you have like a stormwater problem or you want to install a small prairie, they're great people to reach out to for assistance. And I want everybody to kind of notice that I got a lot of space open on this slide still. If you know of anybody that may be interested in becoming a sponsor of our greenhouse, please reach out to me directly at ewright@thenatureinstitute.com. And maybe we could talk about that in the chat later. Well, we need all the help we can get to make this happen for our community. All right, you guys ready to have some fun now? So we got to start off with the obvious. Plants are pretty important. Early in school, we're taught that plants produce the oxygen that we breathe. It's way more complex than that we figure out as adults. So plants they're really remarkable, the way that they can actually take energy from the sun and use a little bit of carbon dioxide and a little bit of water, and they create sugars and starches. And that's the base of all the energies kind of pass through the planet. They also provide services for like water filtration. The above ground biomass of plants actually slow down and stop water and prevent it from kind of, washing everything away. And then below ground, our root systems of plants are actually helping water infiltrate the soils and eventually trickle down to our groundwater sources. Also, with those root systems, we're actually anchoring those soils in place. So what that means is those roots are kind of holding all that dirt together. So when we have a heavy rain, it doesn't wash all that dirt downstream. And topsoil is very valuable, and we're actually having a little bit of a crisis losing that. So the plants actually anchor that soil for us and provide that service. But kind of what I'm going to get into, which is really important, is plants are basically the one and only primary producer. So they're producing those sugars, those starches, and then different animals are eating it, and they're passing all that energy up the food chain. So without plants, none of us would be here. Okay, we're gonna kind of get into like a mini ecology lesson and kind of talk about some definitions and some principles that I think are important for you to really understand, to kind of know the importance of why you should have native plants in your landscaping, your yard, or however you want to do it. Just get some native plants out there. So there's different ways that biologists measure the health of ecosystems. And some of the common ones are species richness, which is like just a simple count of the number of types of species in a community. So in our little tree of life here, we have 6 different things. So that's a species richness of 6. And I got some examples I'm going to show you to help kind of explain these a little bit better. Species evenness actually takes your species richness, but it also takes the relative abundance of those species within that specific richness. Diversity is a little more complex. There's different ways that they kind of take both the abundance and the richness, and they combine it together to create these diversity indexes. And they're fantastic for if you want to compare to like ecosystems. So if you want to compare one forest to like maybe an intact forest to a degraded or restored forest, you can use these diversity indexes to kind of see the quality of those ecosystems. Biodiversity is one that we kind of throw around, but it's a really broad term. And when you're talking about biodiversity, you're talking about kind of the diversity that we measure with our diversity indexes, but also indices. Yeah, whatever. But also it goes all the way down to like the gene level. So do you have genetic variability inside your populations, which is important because it makes that population individually more resilient. All right, let's get into these examples. So I just created these real quick in Excel. And in example 1, what we have to imagine here is each one of these colors is an individual species. So example 1, we got 5 different colors. We have a species richness of 5. So example number 2, we still have those same 5 colors, but so we have our species richness of 5. But we can see this is a dramatically different system because there's just kind of a lot of red and just a little bit of the other ones. So if you want to talk about species evenness, this will be a perfectly even system. We have 3 of everything. We still have our species richness of 5, but everything is evenly distributed across the map here. And that would be great if that's how it worked, but that's not how it works in the real world. Diversity in the real world kind of looks more like this. This is still overly simplistic, but it just kind of gives you a better representation of what happens out there. You're gonna have some species that are real common and highly abundant, and you're gonna have a lot of other species that are just kind of, you find them here and there, but you're not gonna find them everywhere. And each one of these species is still important to the system as a whole. All right, let's get into some more material here. So I want to talk about the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. So there's a couple legendary biologists that were sitting around one day, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, and they were talking. And E.O. Wilson observed that he was counting ants on these specific islands. And what he noticed is every time an island got 10 times larger, that his species richness of ants would actually double. So MacArthur was a great math guy, and they started digging some data to see if this was a pattern that was consistent across different islands and different communities of plants and animals. And what they found is, yeah, this is like a real thing. So when it comes down to it, they determined that the size of the islands, the landmass size, and the distance to the next island is actually going to kind of help determine how many species you have on that island. And that's because on these islands, they're perfect little microcosms of kind of a bigger system. And on those islands, the resources are real finite, so they can only support a given number of species. And this number of species is actually kind of a balance between immigration, emigration, speciation, and extinction. So immigration is the import of plants or animals from somewhere else coming onto your island. Emigration would be if you have something on that island that suddenly says, this is not good for me anymore, and leaves that island. This is more commonly going to happen from a large landmass to a small landmass. Speciation, this one takes a while, but it does happen. That's when a species gets to the island and they're isolated for such a period of time that they actually become genetically unique from their base species. So the species on the mainland might still be the same species, but this new species on the island has different characteristics and can no longer interbreed with that population back on the mainland. Extinction is a scary one that we hear all the time, and that can happen instantaneously. Basically, immigration and extinction are kind of the big players here. You could have, like, say on your island, you have a volcanic eruption and it just wipes out life. Well, you have an extinction event. Immigration, especially on these islands, would be like a storm blows a bunch of debris across the ocean and there's a lizard on a log and ends up on the island. and there ends up being a breeding population that gets established, and now those lizards can thrive on that island. So you're probably wondering, Eric, you're in the middle of the Midwest, and there's not really a lot of islands there, except for maybe some river islands on the Mississippi River. Well, what I did here for you is, if you look at the picture on the right, on the left, of course, we got our beautiful islands, right? That's fantastic. Well, the picture on the right, I would argue, is a picture of an island too. So if you see in the center of the picture, it didn't take me long to kind of scroll through Google Earth and find this, but in the middle of the picture, there's that perfectly square woodlot. And that would be kind of our island. We just have to think about it in a different way. And instead of the ocean being the barrier on our Pacific islands, now the agricultural fields around this woodlot is actually our barrier, and we create this island in a different way. So let's go even deeper into some of this terminology and these ideas. I'm probably going to talk about this kind of throughout, so I want to make sure I define everything for you. So a patch, we got to think like a habitat patch. So it's a specific type of environment that allows certain species to thrive and survive. So if you have a grassland that's going to support grassland birds, the grassland is the patch, and the birds depend on that patch. Okay, so now if we get into the matrix, that's basically everything around the patch. So you know, if you go from prairie to the farm field next to you, now your prairie is that actual patch you're looking at, and the farm field is the matrix. Next up is a buffer. A buffer isn't like the ideal conditions, but it's kind of an in-between ground where a species can kind of go out to the buffer and they get some of the resources there. They still rely on the patch to survive, but the buffer is kind of like they can visit it. As long as they can get back to their patch, they're going to be okay. So it's good to have a little bit of a buffer around all your patches. A barrier is basically when you hit something that a species can't move through. So if you have, let's say, a salamander that can't migrate across a farm field, that farm field is now a barrier. A corridor is when your barrier, when your matrix is no longer a barrier, it's actually favorable for movement in between patches. So on my picture here, what I did is I took the 2 hill prairies at our nature preserve and I circled them in white. And so those hill prairies are habitat patches. Now the matrix, hopefully y'all are saying, oh, it's the trees in between. Yes, it's everything that surrounds that patch. You guys can't see it on the picture because this is an older picture and it's hard to see this from satellite imagery, but we have actually started clearing trees out on the periphery of our hill prairie to create more of a savanna or open woodland. And what this is going to do is it's going to kind of create that buffer to where some of our hill prairie species can pop into the buffer and pop back out and just always have that patch still there for them when they get back. Is our matrix a barrier? Probably for some species, yeah. But ideally what we're trying to do on a kind of long-term goal is the matrix here, all of our oak hickory forests with a lot of maple in it too. We're actually going to start to thin that out and create more of the open woodland to savanna interface that could be more favorable for animals, plants and animals to travel in between our 2 hill prairies. So we're basically manipulating our matrix to make it a buffer / corridor and make sure that's not a barrier for moving between our hill prairies. There's a great classic example of this patch matrix principle idea thing, and it was Alan Templeton and the collared lizard. I wrote this down and I kind of thought it sounded like a really weird, like children's book. But so the way this kind of plays out is Alan Templeton grew up in the Ozarks in Missouri. And as a kid, like a lot of us, he liked to kind of walk around, enjoy the wild world around him. Well, he grew up, he became a great geneticist, and he came back to the Ozarks, and he went back to the Ozarks to find his collared lizards, which was his favorite animal as a kid, and he couldn't find them anymore. So collared lizards are typically a desert species, and they rely on these glades in the middle of the Ozarks. This is a kind of a steep, rocky, thin soil, sloped area that's facing southwest, and it's just hotter and drier, and it supports a different set of species. Well, it's perfect for our lizards. Well, Alan Templeton noticed that there was no more lizards. So we went to check out the conditions of the glades, and basically the glades have been taken over by cedar trees. So Alan Templeton wanted his lizards back. So what he did is they started removing the cedar trees from these glades. Okay, great, but the lizards were already gone. So what they had to do is they borrowed some lizards from another population and reintroduce these collared lizards to these glades. Well, being the geneticist that he is, he actually tracked these populations of collared lizards that were reintroduced to these glades. And he found that the lizards were actually thriving in this restored habitat. But the problem was the lizards were not moving in between the individual glades that they were restoring. So something was going wrong. And ultimately you need the movement between the glades, because if you have the same lizards, say you might have 7 lizards on one glade, if they're just basically inbreeding the whole time, that's going to ultimately lead to extinction. So surrounding the patch of the glade, there was oak hickory forest, kind of typical what you see across all the Ozarks. Well, there was a couple wildfires, and then they just prescribed burning, and they actually did some mechanical removal of trees, and they kind of started to open up that canopy. But when they did that, ta-da, the matrix became more favorable for these lizards to move from patch to patch, from glade to glade. So by managing the matrix, they actually benefited the lizards they were targeting on their glade patch. All right, biodiversity. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this and use a couple of analogies to help get a better grasp on it. Biodiversity is so important because it creates ecosystem stability and resiliency. So when I'm talking about ecosystem stability, we're talking about it might shift back and forth, but it doesn't change drastically over time. Because if you can imagine that if a forest goes straight to prairie, you're going to lose a lot of species because you no longer have the desired habitat of those species. Resiliency, on the other hand, is mainly fueled by biodiversity. And what this is, so say Debbie knows about this, but if you had a tornado kind of wreck through your system and there's not a lot of biodiversity there, it's going to be harder for that system to recover from that disturbance. So if you have biodiversity, then you kind of have you have the building blocks for that system to kind of redevelop over time. There's a couple classic kind of analogies and systems that were developed over time. So let me flip my notes here. Paul and An Elric actually came up with this rivets on the plane analogy. So with this analogy, you have to imagine that your plane is the actual ecosystem, and each individual rivet on that plane, which there's thousands, tens of thousands of rivets on a plane holding it together, is an individual species. So if you lose one rivet here or there, it's actually designed where that plane is still going to hold together. But if you start losing a whole lot of rivets, like in the hundreds to thousands, now you're going to have a big problem. The landing's probably not going to be too fun for you. Well, some people started to point out that maybe some of those rivets on this plane are more important. If I lose 10 rivets across the entire plane, not a big deal. However, if I lose 10 rivets that are holding on one of my engines, I'm going to start to be worried about that. And Robert T. Payne actually did some work in intertidal pools with predatory starfish and mussels and everything. And he discovered that if you remove the predatory starfish from these intertidal pools, the entire ecosystem, which is that intertidal pool, would collapse. And he coined the term keystone species to kind of help people talk about this concept. Well, this was a great thing to look for. So everybody started looking around and they found all kinds of keystone species that are so important that when you're moving from the system, the ecosystem starts to collapse. One classic example of a keystone species is the gray wolves and their reintroduction to the Yellowstone National Park. If you've ever watched one of the videos or read one of the articles about it, it's amazing how the entire ecosystem of Yellowstone changed when you reintroduced those gray wolves, which were basically driving around the herbivorous species and preventing them from kind of browsing down everything to bare ground. But people started to notice there's kind of some problems even with this keystone species idea. So first of all, there's lots of keystone species. Like there's not just one here or there. The gray wolf, I mean, there's all kinds of examples of species you can lose that can make an ecosystem collapse. And some keystone species actually only have a temporary effect. So a keystone species could be a keystone species in the spring, but not in the fall. Another thing is some keystone species are actually redundant. So you have two species that are kind of serving the same regulatory purpose in the ecosystem. And if you get rid of one, you're okay. You lose both, might be a problem. So Peter de Ruyter came up with this Jenga tower analogy that I really like, and it's a little more complex, and I feel like it kind of helps explain it a little bit better. So in the Jenga tower, you have to imagine that your Jenga tower is actually your ecosystem, and each individual block in that ecosystem, each individual block in that Jenga tower is a species. So anytime you remove any block from that ecosystem, the tower becomes less stable. However, the balance of the tower actually shifts every time you remove a block. So the importance of each species is relative to the current condition of the ecosystem. So all species have the potential to sink or save the ecosystem depending on the circumstances. All right, moving on back to biodiversity, ecosystem stability. We're going to tie this all together and get it back to humans again. So biodiversity is the base of my little chain here. And if you have a lot of biodiversity, then you're going to have that stable, resilient ecosystem. Well, if you have a stable, resilient ecosystem, you also have a very efficient ecosystem. And what this means is you're not losing a lot of energy to the outside of that ecosystem. So all the energy that's brought in that ecosystem stays there. Well, if you have a very efficient ecosystem, then you also have a productive ecosystem. And a productive ecosystem is going to give us more fish, more lumber, more water filtration services, more carbon sequestration, and much more. All right, we got to talk about some more definitions. You can't do a native plant webinar without talking about what a native species is, correct? So a native species is commonly defined as a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. That's a lot of words, but what it really comes down to is these species kind of grew up next to each other. They know what they expect from each other. They know how to fight each other. They know how to kind of get around fighting each other. And they develop this complex relationship to where they can all coexist at the same time. So an exotic species, you can take that same definition we just talked about, but replace evolved with not evolved. So it's from somewhere else, and naturally it's going to have an imbalance in that system. An invasive species, it has to be an exotic species, and it also has to cause economic and ecological harm. And we're going to talk even more about exotic species now. So there are estimated over 5,000 exotic species in the United States. In the top right picture here, that's me in my little honeysuckle prison. Apparently I like to do this pose in different pictures because I've got a lot of them. And an exotic species can be any sort of species that's not native to our region. So it could be a plant, an animal, it could be bacteria, fungi, or even viruses. Sometimes these exotic species in our natural areas are actually intentionally introduced. So the bush honeysuckle I just talked about is a great example. It was actually promoted by conservation departments back in the day as a great habitat and forage for birds. But there's also a lot of unintentional introductions of invasive species. For like a lot of diseases and insects, you can actually have them come in piggybacking on other species. So you can import a shrub from another region, and that might carry an insect larvae or a disease. And once that insect larvae emerges or the disease kind of spreads to other plants, now it's been introduced, but you did not do it intentionally. You can also have escaped garden plants or landscaping plants. So burning bush and Japanese barberries are two species that I see in everybody's yard, but I'm killing them on a daily basis when I'm working on our preserves. So this is an unintentional introduction, but also one of the ways that they can get into our natural areas. So invasive species, they're bad for a number of reasons, but when it really comes down to it is they're ecological dead ends. So plants and their corresponding herbivores have actually like grown with each other, and they've kind of had this arm race. Plants are not defenseless. They produce secondary metabolites that either make them unpalatable or even toxic to herbivores. And the herbivores, in turn, they say, I still want to eat that plant because I need my energy. So they might develop an enzyme in their gut that allows them to break down those secondary metabolites. And this arms race just happens over time. And that's how you get a lot of these insect specialists that can only eat certain species. And basically, when you have an exotic species, you're going to have no herbivores because none of these herbivores can actually digest this material because they're not used to the secondary metabolites of these plants. And when you have no herbivores, then you have a non-contributing primary producer. So the plants might be, they're still grabbing up that carbon dioxide and putting some water on there and making their sugars and starches and everything, but they're not passing that energy up the food chain. It's an ecological dead end. And when those plants get out in the wild, that actually gives them a competitive advantage over our native plants because they're not having to deal with herbivores, so they can give all their energy and just growing nonstop. And that allows them to outcompete and replace our native species. And species are, well, let's be honest, they're my job security guys. Once you have a full infestation, it's going to take mechanical and or chemical removal to get rid of them. This is not a easy process. It takes a lot of time and money. And I wish I had a magic wand where I could just fight an invasive species for 1 year and then be done with it, but that's not how it works. You're gonna have to spend multiple years going back, treating the same area to get rid of these once they've fully infested your property. And on top of that, even after you kind of knock them back, maybe even eradicate them, you're still gonna have to monitor for those species, the same species. So they might come back, say your neighbor has a lot of bush honeysuckle, well, the birds might carry in the berries and you more bush honeysuckle again. Also, another thing that could happen is there could be an emerging or a new invasive species. So at any given time, these exotic species have the potential to become invasive. So we have to keep keep our boots on the ground, keep looking for all these different plants out in the wild, and make sure that none of these exotics become invasive and replace our native species. All right, we're going to go into a little doom and gloom here, guys. You ready for this? So it's estimated that 95 to 97% of the United States has been modified to some extent. And to kind of show you this in a picture, I found this classic photograph of light pollution, NASA.gov. I don't think I wrote it on there. But if you can just kind of look at it, it seems like we have so much open space. When you start to look at this light pollution map alone, that's basically covering a whole continent. We don't have a lot of space that hasn't been changed or moved or whatever's happening out there. So 41.4% of the land it's actually used for agriculture. So that's producing the food that we eat on a daily basis. I can validate a lot of the agricultural stuff, but some of the open spaces that you think are unmodified, they could probably be more modified than you think. Our little cow buddy down here in the right-hand corner, it can seem like you have a natural area, but it's actually just a pasture that just has a few good trees left on it. So while agriculture has to happen, it does use a significant amount of our land in the United States. So if you did the math on that, that means that 53.6 to 55.6% of land is cities and suburbia. And it's just hard for me to even grasp this. But if you guys are driving around or even like flying over the United States, just take a look down or look out your window and like critically think about what you're seeing out these windows. You think you see a lot of open space, but really that's just humans using lands in different ways. There's not a lot of stuff that's still actually wild out there. And when you do start to drive through some of those wild areas, you probably notice it. It's pretty drastically different than everything else. So of suburbia, we have 4 million miles of road in the United States. And this number is a little bit old, so it's probably more than that now. We also have 45,000 square miles of paved surfaces. So that is enough area to cover the entire state of Indiana. On my map here, this is actually just the state of Illinois, highlighting the paved surfaces in Illinois. So you can kind of see in the Chicago metro region, you have a lot of concrete, a lot of paved surfaces there. And then you have kind of your little hubs around Illinois and then all the highways that connect. So paved surfaces, I can't do anything about them because I love traveling and I'm gonna keep driving on my roads, but they are kind of significantly impacting our landscape. And I'm going to try to not get too preachy on this, but we got a lot of lawn in this country, guys. So we have somewhere between 62,500 and 78,000 square miles of lawns. It's the largest irrigated crop in the United States. This map doesn't do it any justice for how extreme our lawns really are. So the state of Illinois is 56,000 square miles. So we have enough lawn in the United States to cover the entire state of Illinois and then still have some left over for a few more golf courses. I'm totally like anti-lawn because they're ecological deserts. They're all exotic species. So lawns are I'm not a big fan. Plus, I don't like cutting grass. All right, so that leaves us with less than 5% of habitat. Among that habitat, it's all pretty small patches. They're not the vast wildernesses that we used to have. They're also very fragmented, separated by our suburbs, our cities, and the farm fields and everything. The stuff we do have left is pretty highly degraded, maybe from previous land uses, logging, grazing, or whatnot. And I like to call it basically the leftovers in Illinois. So if you're familiar with the topography in Illinois, I actually pulled up this picture of a property I used to work on. And if it's flat in Illinois, you farm it. So on our picture here, you can kind of see all these wooded fingers in the picture. And that's basically, those are the drainages. So the slope got too steep for them to farm it within reason. So they just don't farm it. And all the farm field, those are nice flat ridges. And this irregular shape and kind of fragmented habitat is not the best quality stuff for our native ecosystems. All right, we're done with the doom and gloom, guys. So let's actually talk about native plants and native plant gardening for just a second here. So why do we garden in the first place? I'm just going to tell you, plants are cool. Everybody loves the pretty flowers, of course, but I actually take a lot of joy in watching a plant develop through its life cycle. So, you start off with a little seedling and it starts growing, it gets a lot bigger, and then you get your beautiful flowers. And then, I actually appreciate the development of seed. And there's a certain character that plants have in the winter that is unique to each individual species. So you might also garden for beautification. Maybe you're just trying to make your space just a little more pretty, so you like being in it a little bit better. Maybe you're just trying to fit in your neighborhood. Excuse me. I mean, nobody wants to be that one neighbor with a messy yard and everything. So beautification is definitely a great reason to garden. Gardening is good for our health. I mean, if you're out there digging and sweating, you're burning some calories. It's good for you. Also, a little bit of sunshine and fresh air has never hurt anybody. I also appreciate gardening as a creative outlet. So I kind of see gardening as a way to kind of express myself, especially my landscaping. Everybody knows I'm a little bit wild already. So when I start putting in these native plants, they're just like, oh, that's an Eric thing. It's not too crazy. Another thing that I think is undervalued is the actual, so no gardening project is going to go perfect, and you're going to have to come up with solutions along the way. And so you kind of got to be creative with your problem solving and how to get over some of these little obstacles that you never expected to happen, but then they're there and you got to find a way to fix them. I think that's fun. So why native plants is our next question. Click this real quick. So I've read all the books. I've been to a lot of webinars, a lot of talks, and I try to kind of break down this vast information into three very overly simplistic categories. So we're going to talk about the romantic, practical, and the ecological. And some of these do overlap in a lot of ways. Hope I'm froze up. Okay, so first of all, if you read through the books and everything, there's all these great sayings like the sense of place. This stuff is just a little too fluffy for me personally, but I do see its value. The sense of place, the nature of your place, the aesthetics of your region. We're here in the Midwest. I know some of you are from all parts of the country, but kind of you might not realize it unless you like really start looking at plants around the country. But there are plants that you see and kind of take for granted, but when you get to other parts of the country, they're just not there at all. So if you have those native plants in your yard, you can kind of identify where you're at based on the plants. Really great concept. You also can kind of connect your yard to the surrounding natural areas. So if we remember the words we were talking about earlier, can you become a buffer? I love this line by Dave Tilka. He says, the windows of your home become windows to the natural world. I would add your back porch would be another thing here. He used windows because the animals can't see inside and everything. But if you just sit there and kind of watch your native plants through your window or sitting on your porch, you're going to start to see all kinds of activity you haven't seen before. And it's just really, it's a really great experience, just kind of connecting with your garden in a different sort of way. So the practical reasons to have native plants. So native plants are relatively easy to grow. They're adapted to our conditions and they thrive in our conditions. So once you get them in the ground, it doesn't take a lot to just keep them there in perpetuity. When you put in a native plant, you're going to have to do no or less soil amendment. They're adapted to these conditions, so they can actually find the nutrients that they need to grow within your existing soil. Sometimes you got to do a little bit of work depending on what you're doing, but for the most part, you don't have to do anything. A lot less watering of your native plants. I'm not saying no watering, because you have to kind of help your native plants out, especially when as they're getting established. Basically, I typically water for the first year, maybe like later in the summer if there's enough rain, I'll kind of let off. And then if you have like long extended dry periods, maybe you should water your plants too. But for the most part, those deep root systems in native plants mean that you don't have to water these plants at all. There's also a reduction in pollution. So some of our exotic species actually require a little bit of fertilizer to keep them going every year. Well, what you don't realize is you think you're doing, you're feeding this plant all this food, but most of that fertilizer is being washed away with rainwater and not actually going to your plant at all. Well, when it's being washed away, it's being washed away somewhere, and so it becomes a source of pollution. Did I mention the wastefulness of lawns yet? We'll just leave that there. Also, you don't have to necessarily have native trees for this to happen, but trees actually reduce your power bills. So if you have a large shade tree on the south side of your house, that's going to block that hot summer sun, and it's going to kind of lower your air conditioning bill in the summertime. And on your north side of the house, if you have some trees back there, it's going to block those winter north winds. They're actually going to reduce your heating bill. And then this is more of my stuff. So there's all kinds of ecological benefits to having native plants in your yard. Just the wildlife benefits across the board are great. I already talked about how our wildlife species are all interconnected. So you have those native plants in there, now the wildlife can actually use your yard again. Native plants have 4 seasons of wildlife benefits. So once they pop up and start growing green, then they're actually going to be a source for herbivory. As they're growing, you're going to continue to have your caterpillars and different animals eat your plants, which is a compliment. And then eventually they're going to pop up and they're going to throw up some blooms. Now your pollinators come in and they're just going nuts on all your beautiful native flowers. Also, those flowers eventually become seeds. So those seeds are actually going to kind of stay on the plant or on the ground near the plant, and they're going to be there for wildlife to enjoy through the fall months and the winter months. And what some people don't know is when you leave your stems up of your native plants, that actually creates even more habitat. A lot of our native bees and wasps actually use those stems to overwinter with their larvae or their pupae. And when they pop up in the spring, they're there for you. So if you have native plants in your landscaping, you're actually preventing invasive species. We talked about how our exotic species always have the potential to become an invasive species. Well, if you don't have any exotic species, then you're preventing invasive species. We have to raise a lot of awareness for our cause here. People are very disconnected from nature. So if we have these native plants in our yard and we can show the benefits of having these native plants, that we can actually be raising awareness about the ecological struggle that we're in the middle of right now. So what can we do? And this is where I'm going to go on my little philosophical rant about how I hate the word natural. So when we think of the word natural, a lot of people kind of define it as outside or no human influence. And what this does is it creates a humans versus nature mentality. And when it's humans versus nature, we're more likely to kind of exploit our natural resources because it's us versus them. And I would argue that humans are definitely a part of nature. We were born from the same biological and evolutionary processes as all the plants and animals around us. So we're not outside nature, we're actually one with nature. And maybe if we can start thinking like this, we'll find better ways and be better stewards of the land and learn to coexist with our fellow species. End rant. So overall, we need just a big, big paradigm shift the way we kind of see the space that we live in and how we use our land across the country. One big thing would be if we could just reduce lawn. If you think about all the time and energy that you spend mowing grass or all the gasoline you get to put in that mower, just getting rid of your lawn makes a lot of sense for a lot of practical reasons. And then we also talk about all the wildlife stuff you can do when you put those native plants in instead of your turf grass. My personal goal is I want to get one native plant in every yard. And from my experience, what I found is once I get one native plant in somebody's yard, they want more native plants. So if I can get a lot of native plants in everybody's yard, I'm doing my job. We should always share the beauty and benefits of our native plants. If you want to show those, your native plant full of pollinators, share it on Facebook, on all your different social media outlets. It's great to kind of show people how these native plants are just making your property better, your own little space. And ultimately what we want to do is, I feel like our current suburbia and city we're barriers with our turf grass and our exotic plants. We don't allow for our native species to kind of travel through us and across us to get to the other natural areas that still exist. And hopefully if we start adding these native plants, we can actually turn our yards into buffers. If we get enough buffers stacked next to each other, then that buffer actually becomes a travel corridor. And our native species can move from habitat patch to habitat patch through our yards in a more free way. If you really go crazy and you replace most of your yard with native stuff, then maybe you can become your own little habitat island too. So there's a lot of potential, and this is a movement it's not new, but I feel like it's growing in a lot of ways with all the great organizations doing so many great things. All right, so that's basically the end of the presentation. I just want to tell you guys about some of the stuff we have coming up. Like I mentioned earlier, the next webinar is in 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about designing your own native plant project. 2 weeks after that, we're going to the native plant installation and maintenance. Probably going to do more design stuff there. And then we're going to end that with native plant propagation. We're going to kind of do a virtual tour of our greenhouse and some of the methods that we use to propagate native plants in our greenhouse here at the Nature Institute. P&I wildflower market is the whole reason we're doing all this, because every year we've done an annual native plant sale. And this year we're trying to grow a little bit. So we're inviting some outside vendors in. And this is going to be a bigger event than we've ever had before. It's going to be on May 8th from 9 a.m. to noon here at the Nature Institute. Visit our website for more information about all that stuff. And you guys are the first people to hear about all this. So we are officially announcing our vendors for our wildflower market. We have a couple great organizations that are local and they grow native plants too. Pure Our Natives, Lewis and Clark Community College Restoration Ecology Program, River City Natives, Green Thumb Nursery. And we wanted to be able to provide some more trees and shrubs, which normally that's more of a specialist thing. So we reached out to Forest Relief Missouri, and they're going to come over and provide some trees and shrubs for our wildflower market. And we're all excited, right? Because I'm done talking about this. No, if anybody has any questions, or if Emily or Debbie, if you've noticed anything in the chat that I kind of brushed over that you'd like for me to expand upon, we do have some time left. Yep, I hit my 45 minutes that I was shooting for. So where are we at?
Eric, somebody asked about one of the yellow flowers that you had about 5 slides back, and I think it might have been showy goldenrod, but I wasn't sure. So if you could maybe back up with your presentation and see what that flower was, the yellow flower. Somebody had asked about what that was and wondered about that for a garden.
The slide was the one that says the practical, Eric. Yeah, there you go.
So this is actually a rigid or stiff goldenrod. And this is a plant that I had that my parents installed alongside their house. It definitely did great. And, you know, a lot of people don't like the goldenrods, but I think about the field goldenrods. Goldenrods are so important as a late summer, early fall food source for pollinators. So this goldenrod alone was just covered in bees and butterflies. It was one of the few things that was still in full blooming glory at this time of year. So I recommend getting a diversity of plants, and I just have all these random pictures, and you can't have all words on slides, right?
So Eric, we have a request that you put the screen with the dates back up. And then also Megan has a question. Go ahead, Megan. Megan Wolf, you want to ask your question? Okay.
Maybe she doesn't know her hand is up.
Yeah. Carla says in the chat, is asking thoughts on what natives grow here in Southern Illinois to benefit our area.
So I wish I had a short answer for you there. There's all kinds of great plants, and actually in our next couple webinars, I'm gonna kind of help you guys start to find plants that would be more specific to your area. And just come to the next webinar, and I'll talk a lot about kind of finding plants and selecting what plants would be great for your area.
Okay, there's a question from Mrs. Christoph. What do you recommend as a gateway native for suburbanites with HOAs that restrict landscaping with wildflowers, which is a good question. Homeowner association is HOAs for people that don't know that. Eric, do you want to answer or you want me to answer?
I'll answer. Sorry, I was having technical difficulty. So let's go with the big boys here. You want something that probably isn't big, tall, and lanky, and you want something that's showy and probably has a long bloom period. So the two that come to my mind first are the purple coneflower, a very iconic flower of the Midwest, or a butterfly milkweed. Because if you say, hey, I'm trying to help the monarchs, who's going to argue with that? So there's some other species that can work really well. They can be a little more aggressive, but I've been kind of experimenting with using, I have a slender mountain mint that I actually trim to make it kind of look like a bush. So you can kind of trick people into thinking some of these native plants are something that they're not. But we're going to cover a lot more of that when we're talking about designing and kind of maintaining our native plant projects in the next webinars too.
So another question from Shandy Grove, Grieve Penrod, indirectly related, the mosquitoes in our yard are terrible, and we've done all we can to remove standing water, things we can do. We spray for mosquitoes frequently out of necessity, but I worry about the bees and other beneficial insects. Do you have thoughts on this as a part of our garden care?
I do have thoughts on this, and I actually am helping a friend currently with this. I don't do this as part of working for the Nature Institute, but kind of friend family. I help them with kind of designing little projects. And the kind of the thought process behind it is you want to create your own little mini ecosystem in your yard. So in that ecosystem, you're going to have your native plants as the base. Well, also you're going to have some herbivores. You're going to have your native insects that are actually eating those. You're going to have your pollinators. You're going to have your predators too. So if you have all these native plants, this ecosystem built up, you're going to have predators you draw into your yard to actually eat up those mosquitoes. So if you kind of build your yard as an ecosystem, then you can reduce some of those pest species that are less desirable in your yard, like your mosquitoes. So more biodiversity, the better, is basically what I'm getting at there.
And also sometimes bat boxes can be helpful potentially. It depends where you live and what's surrounding you, but bats are voracious eaters of mosquitoes, and you might want to encourage some of the solitary bat species, right, Eric, to come into your yard with a bat box. So
I'm a full proponent of bat boxes, bluebird boxes, any kind of bird box you can put in your yard is it's going to probably be a benefit. Definitely do your research on kind of where to place and build, because a lot of these different houses for wildlife have very specific requirements. There are some organizations that actually help you build those boxes, or maybe they can just ship them to you. So that is something to look into. I don't know the numbers behind the bat boxes, but I would definitely try it.
What happened here?
Oh, no, I thought I just ordered tacos.
Bill? Sushi? Ramen?
Burger?
Well, I guess if there's no more questions, we're running against time here. I hope everybody can make it out to our next several webinars we're doing here. We're doing them on Thursday nights. We just feel like it's a pretty easy time for people to kind of, get online and do what we got to do these days. And we're really excited about the wildflower market, just the ability to have more plants, more variety of plants, and get more plants into people's yard is kind of just really what we're going for here. So hopefully anybody that's local enough to make it to the wildflower market can come out and see us. If you can't make it to ours, there's multiple other wildflower markets kind of in the St. Louis area. And if you look for them in your region, you'll probably find them there too. And on that, if we don't have any more questions, I'm ready to call it, guys.
there is a question, where is the market?
So the market is going to be located on our property in Godfrey, Illinois. And we are located, it's, if you've ever been back to us, there's Levis Lane and South Levis Lane, and our greenhouse is there on the corner. And we're going to set up the sale there. We're going to have a pretty big tent set up, and you're probably going to see lots of cars. So hopefully once you get close, you'll be able to kind of figure out where you're at. And thank you, Emily, for putting the address up. Just kind of scrolling the chat here. Great. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We're going to go ahead and end it here. Hopefully we can see you
There's
in a
one more
couple
question,
weeks.
Eric. There's one more question about any books that you recommend on creating native gardens.
I almost put a slide together with all the books that I have, and I have a lot of books, and I didn't do it. How about I will compile a bibliography and we'll send it out as a follow-up email, and then also I'll make sure that I include it as a slide for the next webinar series. Maybe I'll take a picture of all the books, because all these books, there's at least going to be one thing that's useful in them for you. And it's just really great to see different people's perspectives. That's why I go to these other webinars, because we all kind of know the same information, but getting somebody else's perspective is going to help each one of us kind of further our understanding of this topic. All right. Last chance, last call for questions.